The wind screamed past her ears as Sarah Martinez plummeted through the empty sky, watching the helicopter grow smaller above her. For 3 terrifying seconds, she experienced what every person fears most, the sensation of falling with nothing to catch them. Her radio crackled with panicked voices. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The rocky mountainside rushed toward her at deadly speed. But Sarah Martinez wasn't just anyone falling from a helicopter. She was a U.S. Forest Service ranger who had spent 8 years mastering every survival skill imaginable. What happened next would become legendary among search and rescue teams across the country. A story that would challenge everything people thought they knew about human limits, quick thinking, and the incredible power of training when death seems certain. This is the true story of how a routine rescue mission turned into an impossible survival situation, and how one woman's refusal to give up saved not just her own life, but changed emergency protocols forever. What you're about to read happened exactly as described, witnessed by multiple people, and documented in official reports that some still find hard to believe. The helicopter incident was just the beginning. The alarm clock hadn't even gone off when Sarah Martinez's phone started buzzing on the nightstand. She grabbed it instinctively, already knowing what a 4:30 a.m. call meant in her line of work. As a senior ranger with the U.S. Forest Service, emergency calls were part of the job, but something about the urgency in dispatcher's voice made her sit up straighter in bed. "We have a situation at Devil's Ridge," the voice crackled through the speaker. "Missing hiker, 24 hours overdue. Weather window is closing fast. We need you airborne in 30 minutes." Sarah swung her legs out of bed, already mentally preparing for what lay ahead. Devil's Ridge was notorious among rangers, a jagged stretch of mountain terrain in northern Colorado where even experienced hikers got into trouble. The area was a maze of narrow ledges, hidden caves, and steep drops that could turn deadly without warning. She had pulled people out of there before, but never with such short notice, and never with weather moving in. 25 minutes later, she was strapping herself into the passenger seat of the Forest Service helicopter, piloted by Jake Thompson, a former military aviator with 15 years of mountain rescue experience. The machine lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, its rotors cutting through air that was already starting to feel heavy with the approaching storm system.
"What do we know about our hiker?" Sarah asked through her headset as they gained altitude.
Jake checked his notes while keeping one eye on the instruments. Marcus Webb, 31 years old, experienced outdoorsman from Denver. Started a solo day hike yesterday morning on the Devil's Ridge Trail. Never made it back to his car. His girlfriend called it in when he didn't answer his phone by evening. Sarah nodded, pulling up the topographical map on her tablet. She knew this area better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. Every ridge, every potential shelter, every spot where someone might take refuge or get trapped. The problem with Devil's Ridge wasn't just the terrain. It was how the landscape could completely hide someone from aerial view. Deep crevices and overhanging rocks created blind spots that could conceal a person just a few feet away from searchers. "Storm's moving faster than predicted," Jake observed, glancing at the weather radar. "We'll have maybe 2 hours before conditions get too rough for safe flying." 2 hours to find someone in 12 square miles of some of the most challenging terrain in Colorado. Sarah had worked with worse odds before, but not often. She began mentally cataloging the most likely scenarios. An experienced hiker who knew enough to attempt Devil's Ridge solo would probably have basic survival gear. If he was injured but conscious, he would try to signal for help. If he was unconscious or trapped, they would need to search every possible shelter systematically. The sun was just beginning to touch the eastern peaks when they reached the search area. Below them, Devil's Ridge spread out like a giant's broken spine, all sharp edges and deep shadows. Jake began the first sweep pattern, flying low enough to spot any signs of human activity, but high enough to maintain safe clearance from the rocky outcroppings. There, Sarah pointed to a section of trail visible through a gap in the rocks. That's where the main trail splits. Most people take the left fork because it looks easier, but the right fork actually leads to better views. An experienced hiker might choose the harder route. They spent the next hour methodically working through the most probable locations. Sarah used binoculars to scan every ledge and crevice while Jake maneuvered the helicopter with the precision of a surgeon. They found a few pieces of gear that might have belonged to their missing hiker. A water bottle wedged between rocks, what looked like a torn piece of fabric hanging from a tree branch, but no sign of Marcus Webb himself. "Check that overhang at 2 o'clock, Sarah called out, spotting a formation that could provide shelter. Jake banked the helicopter to get a better angle, and that's when Sarah saw it, a flash of orange that didn't belong in the natural landscape. "There. Emergency bivvy sack, definitely human-made," she said, excitement building in her voice. "Put us down on that flat section about 100 yards east." I'll hike in and make visual contact. But as Jake positioned the helicopter for landing, they encountered the first sign that this rescue was going to be more complicated than usual. The wind conditions near the ridge were creating dangerous downdrafts and unpredictable air currents. The helicopter bucked and swayed as Jake fought to maintain control. "This is no good," Jake said through gritted teeth. "The wind shear is too severe for a safe landing here. I'm going to have to find another spot." Sarah studied the terrain below. The nearest safe landing zone was almost half a mile away, which would add significant time to reach the potential victim. Time they couldn't afford with the weather deteriorating and the possibility that Marcus might be seriously injured. "What about using the rescue harness?" Sarah suggested.
"Lower me down directly to the site, then extract both of us once I assess the situation." Jake considered this option.
Using the helicopter's rescue hoist system was more complex and dangerous than a simple landing, but it would cut their response time significantly.
He looked at the weather readings again, then at the orange spot that marked their potential victim. "It's risky," he said finally. "These wind conditions are pushing the limits of safe hoist operations. If something goes wrong, we could both be in serious trouble." Sarah was already reaching for her rescue harness. In 8 years as a ranger, she had been lowered from helicopters dozens of times, though never in conditions quite like these. But she also knew that every minute of delay could be the difference between life and death for Marcus Webb. "I've done this before," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Just keep us steady and watch the wind gauges. If conditions get worse, we abort and try the long hike." Jake began positioning the helicopter over the target site, while Sarah double-checked her equipment. Rescue harness secure, radio functioning, first aid kit attached. Emergency beacon activated. Everything by the book, exactly as she had been trained. What neither of them could have predicted was the sudden wind gust that hit the helicopter just as Jake engaged the hoist mechanism. A massive downdraft, invisible and unpredictable, slammed into the aircraft with the force of a giant's fist. The helicopter dropped 15 feet in less than 2 seconds, its tail rotor missing the ridge face by inches. Jake fought the controls desperately, trying to regain stable hover, while the helicopter bucked like an angry horse. Sarah, already clipped into the rescue line, felt herself jerked sideways as the aircraft lurched. The careful positioning they had established was gone in an instant. "Abort! Abort!" Jake shouted into his microphone. But his words were lost in the screaming wind and the sound of the helicopter's engines straining against the turbulence. Sarah looked down and realized with growing alarm that she was no longer positioned over the relatively safe landing spot they had chosen. The helicopter's violent movement had carried her over one of the deepest ravines in the area, a rocky chasm that dropped more than 300 feet to a boulder-strewn floor. "Jake, we need to reposition," she called into her radio. But before she could finish the sentence, another massive gust hit the helicopter. This one was different, stronger and more sustained. Jake lost altitude control entirely as the downdraft overwhelmed the aircraft's ability to maintain lift. The helicopter dropped like a stone, and Sarah felt the rescue line go slack. For one terrifying moment, she realized she was no longer connected to anything solid. The mechanical failure that followed happened too fast for either of them to fully understand. A critical component in the hoist mechanism snapped under the stress of the violent turbulence. Sarah Martinez found herself falling through empty air 300 feet above a rocky ravine, watching the helicopter disappear above her as Jake fought to regain control of his damaged aircraft. The orange emergency bivy sack she had spotted was now far below her and to the left. The rocky walls of the ravine rushed past her with deadly speed. In that moment of absolute terror, as she fell towards certain death, Sarah's training kicked in with automatic precision. 8 years of emergency response, countless hours of survival instruction, and an iron determination not to give up combined in her mind. She might not have a parachute, but she was a U.S. Forest Service Ranger, and Rangers didn't quit. She had perhaps 3 seconds to live. Everything she did in those 3 seconds would determine whether she survived or became another statistic in the mountains she had spent her career protecting. The wind screamed past her ears as she spread her arms and legs, using every technique she could remember about controlling a fall. 3 seconds to prove that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, the impossible becomes possible. As Sarah Martinez plummeted through the mountain air, her mind switched into what psychologists call hypervigilance mode, a state where time seems to slow down and the brain processes information at incredible speed. Every second of her fall stretched out like an hour as her trained instincts took over. The first thing she did was spread her arms and legs wide to create maximum air resistance. This wasn't enough to save her life, but it could slow her descent by as much as 20%. Every fraction of a second mattered when the difference between survival and death was measured in split seconds. The second thing she did was scan the ravine walls for anything that might break her fall. Most people falling from such a height would focus on the bottom, paralyzed by terror at their destination. But Sarah forced herself to look at the journey instead. The rocky walls weren't smooth. They had ledges, outcroppings, and scattered vegetation that might provide some hope. 30 feet down, she spotted what she was looking for. A narrow ledge covered with thick mountain shrubs about halfway down the ravine wall. It wasn't much, but it was angled in a way that might deflect rather than stop her fall entirely. If she could somehow control her descent to hit that ledge at the right angle, she might survive. The physics of what Sarah attempted next had never been taught in any ranger manual, because nobody had ever survived to document it. Using subtle movements of her arms and legs, she began trying to steer her fall toward the shrub-covered ledge. It was like trying to fly without wings, but she had seen enough base jumpers and paragliders to understand the basic principles of air resistance and body position. 60 feet down, she realized she was going to miss the ledge by several feet. The angle was all wrong, and she was falling too fast to make major course corrections. This is when Sarah Martinez did something that would later be studied by survival experts and emergency response teams around the world. Instead of accepting defeat, she used her position and momentum to attempt what rock climbers call a dynamic move, essentially jumping while falling. As she passed level with the ledge, she threw her body sideways with every ounce of strength she possessed, aiming not for a perfect landing, but for any contact that might change her trajectory. Her left shoulder slammed into the rocky ledge with bone-crushing force, spinning her body around and sending her tumbling along the narrow shelf. The impact shattered her collarbone instantly, but it also accomplished something crucial. It broke her straight vertical fall and redirected her momentum along the mountainside instead of directly toward the bottom. Sarah bounced off the ledge and continued falling, but now at an angle that carried her toward a steep slope rather than a sheer drop. She hit the slope 40 feet later, rolling and tumbling down loose rock and dirt at a speed that would have killed most people instantly. But the angle of impact was shallow enough that the mountain itself began to slow her descent. She rolled for what felt like an eternity, her body slamming into rocks and scrub bushes, each impact stealing a little more of her momentum. Her ranger uniform was shredded. Her left arm hung useless from her damaged shoulder. Blood streamed from dozens of cuts and scrapes. But she was slowing down. The final stop came when her body wedged into a cluster of sturdy pine trees growing from a crack in the rock face. The trees bent under the impact but held firm, creating a natural cradle that prevented her from continuing down to the bottom of the ravine. Sarah Martinez lay motionless among the pine boughs, barely conscious but incredibly, impossibly alive. Above her, Jake Thompson was fighting his own battle for survival. The same wind shear that had caused Sarah's fall had damaged the helicopter's tail rotor assembly. Warning lights flashed across his instrument panel as he struggled to maintain control of an aircraft that wanted to spin out of control and crash into the mountain. Every instinct told him to find the nearest safe landing area and get the damaged helicopter on the ground before it killed him. But through his headset, he could hear Sarah's emergency beacon transmitting from somewhere far below. She had fallen 300 feet. Logic said she was dead, but Jake Thompson didn't operate on logic alone. He operated on hope and stubborn determination. Fighting the helicopter's damaged controls, he managed to gain enough altitude to clear the immediate danger of the ridge faces. The tail rotor was functioning, but barely. Any sudden maneuver or strong wind gust could send him spinning into the rocks. He needed to find Sarah and confirm her condition before attempting to reach the nearest airport. What Jake saw when he finally managed to position the helicopter over Sarah's location defied everything he thought he knew about human survival. Through his binoculars, he could see her lying motionless in the pine trees. But she was moving slightly. She was breathing. She was alive. "Sarah, Sarah, can you hear me?" He called into his radio, knowing that her emergency beacon should allow two-way communication if she was conscious. The response came back weak but clear. "Jake, I'm alive. Injured but alive. Don't attempt extraction with damaged aircraft. Get yourself to safety first." Even in her battered condition, Sarah's ranger training was still operational. She understood that Jake's helicopter was compromised, and that attempting a rescue in current conditions would likely result in both of their deaths. But Jake Thompson wasn't about to abandon his partner to die slowly in the wilderness. "Negative on that, Sarah. I'm calling in backup, but I need to maintain visual contact with your position until help arrives." What followed was one of the most challenging helicopter flights ever attempted in Colorado mountain rescue history. Jake spent the next 45 minutes hovering near Sarah's position while fighting increasingly dangerous wind conditions and mechanical problems. He couldn't land safely, and he couldn't attempt a rescue, but he could serve as a communications relay. and ensure that when backup arrived, they would know exactly where to find her. Meanwhile, Sarah was conducting her own damage assessment with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 8 years of mountain rescues. The shattered collarbone was obvious. Waves of pain shot through her left side with every breath. Her left arm was completely unusable. She could feel at least 2 broken ribs grinding against each other when she moved, but more importantly, she could feel her legs. She could wiggle her fingers on her right hand. Her spine seemed intact, which meant the difference between eventual recovery and permanent paralysis. She had survived a fall that should have killed her instantly, and now she needed to survive long enough for rescue to reach her. The pine trees that had saved her life were growing from a ledge roughly 8 feet wide and 15 feet long, enough space to wait for rescue, but precarious enough that any careless movement could send her tumbling the remaining distance to the bottom of the ravine. Sarah carefully positioned herself against the most stable tree trunk and began taking inventory of her emergency gear. Her first aid kit had survived the fall, though most of its contents were scattered among the pine boughs. She managed to retrieve a roll of medical tape, some antiseptic wipes, and emergency pain medication that she wasn't sure she dared take while possibly concussed. Her emergency radio was damaged but still functional for receiving transmissions. Most importantly, her emergency beacon was working perfectly, sending out a signal that would guide rescue teams directly to her location. But Sarah knew that rescue in these conditions wouldn't be simple or fast. The approaching storm that had created the wind conditions responsible for her fall was still moving in. Weather reports indicated that helicopter operations would be impossible within hours. As if to confirm her fears, Jake's voice crackled through her damaged radio. "Sarah, I'm seeing lightning in the distance. Storm's moving faster than predicted. I'm going to have to get this bird on the ground before I lose it completely. The ground teams are already mobilizing. They'll reach you, I promise." Sarah watched the helicopter disappear over the ridge, leaving her alone on her precarious perch with nothing but her training, her determination, and the growing certainty that her real survival ordeal was just beginning. The fall had been 3 seconds of terror, but surviving until rescue arrived might take hours or even days. She had proven that rangers don't need parachutes to survive a fall from a helicopter. Now she needed to prove that they don't need perfect conditions to survive in the wilderness, with multiple serious injuries and a major storm approaching. The mountain that had tried to kill her was about to test every survival skill she had ever learned. The first drops of rain began falling just 20 minutes after Jake's helicopter disappeared over the ridge. Sarah Martinez watched the drops darken the rocky ledge around her and felt her heart sink with the realization that her survival situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Rain in the mountains wasn't just about getting wet, it meant hypothermia, even in summer. It meant slippery rocks and reduced visibility for rescue teams. Most critically, it meant flash floods in the ravines and valleys below her position. She was sheltered in a cluster of pine trees on a rocky ledge, but if the storm intensified, water cascading down the mountainside could turn her refuge into a death trap. Sarah forced herself to think systematically through her situation, the way she had been trained to assess emergencies. Immediate threats, exposure, blood loss, shock, and the possibility of falling from her precarious position. Secondary threats, hypothermia, dehydration, infection from her numerous cuts and scrapes. Long-term threats, the approaching storm system, and the likelihood that ground-based rescue would be delayed or impossible until weather conditions improved. With her left arm completely useless due to the shattered collarbone, every movement required careful planning. She managed to retrieve her emergency space blanket from the scattered contents of her gear, but wrapping it around herself one-handed while maintaining her position among the pine branches proved almost impossible. The metallic material kept slipping from her grip, and twice she nearly lost it entirely to the wind that was beginning to pick up as the storm approached. The pain from her broken ribs made breathing difficult, and she could feel blood seeping from a deep gash on her left leg that she hadn't noticed during her initial assessment. Sarah knew she needed to address the bleeding before shock set in, but her first aid supplies were scattered across the ledge and moving to collect them meant risking a fall. That's when she heard something that initially filled her with hope, then quickly turned to alarm. Voices were echoing up from the ravine below her, human voices calling her name. Ground-based rescue teams had reached the area much faster than she had expected, which should have been wonderful news. Sarah Martinez, can you hear us?" The voices were coming from directly below her position, which meant the rescue teams were at the bottom of the ravine looking up. They could hear her emergency beacon, but they couldn't see her exact location among the rocky outcroppings and pine trees. "I'm here," Sarah called back, using as much voice projection as her injured ribs would allow. "I'm alive, about halfway up the west wall, in a cluster of pine trees. What happened next demonstrated just how dangerous mountain rescue operations can become when conditions deteriorate rapidly. The rescue team below, eager to reach her quickly, began attempting to climb directly up the ravine wall toward her position. In normal conditions, this would have been a reasonable approach. But with rain beginning to fall and rocks becoming slippery, it was exactly the wrong decision. Sarah watched in horror as loose rocks and small avalanches of gravel began cascading down from the climbers above her. What had been a relatively stable slope was turning treacherous as the rainfall increased. She realized that the rescue team was inadvertently creating conditions that could bring tons of loose rock down directly onto her position. "Stop! Stop climbing!" she shouted down to them. "The slope is unstable. You're creating a rock slide." But her voice, weakened by pain in the distance, couldn't carry clearly over the sound of the wind and rain. The rescue team continued their ascent, and Sarah could see larger rocks beginning to shift and tumble from points above her. She was trapped between falling rocks and a 300-foot drop with no way to move to safety. The first basketball-sized boulder missed her by less than 6 feet, crashing through the pine branches and continuing its deadly journey to the bottom of the ravine. The second rock, considerably larger, struck the ledge just above her position and shattered into dozens of sharp fragments that rained down around her. Sarah pressed herself as close to the mountain face as possible, using the largest pine trunk as minimal shelter while rocks continued to fall around her. She could hear the rescue team shouting to each other below, finally realizing the danger they had created. But the rock slide had taken on a life of its own. "Get back! Everyone get back!" The voice belonged to Tom Rodriguez, the lead rescue coordinator, and it carried the authority of someone who had seen mountain disasters before. "Abort the climb. The whole slope is compromised." For 10 terrifying minutes, Sarah listened to rocks bouncing off the ravine walls around her while she pressed against her tree trunk shelter. A sharp stone fragment opened a new cut across her forehead, adding to the blood that was already making it difficult to see clearly. The space blanket that she had finally managed to secure was torn to shreds by falling debris. When the rock slide finally stopped, Sarah realized that her situation had become dramatically worse. The route that the rescue team had been attempting to climb was now completely impassable, blocked by tons of newly fallen rock. The alternative routes up the ravine wall would take hours to navigate safely, and the weather was deteriorating by the minute. "Sarah, are you still there? Are you injured?" Tom's voice carried up from the bottom of the ravine. "I'm here," she called back, though her voice was noticeably weaker than before. "Some cuts from falling rock, but still stable. The direct climb is too dangerous.
You need to find another approach."
What Tom Rodriguez didn't tell her immediately was that the Weather Service had just issued a flash flood warning for the entire area.
The storm system was intensifying beyond original predictions, and meteorologists were forecasting 3 to 5 inches of rainfall in the next 4 hours. The ravine, where the rescue team was currently positioned, would become a raging torrent within a matter of hours. "Sarah, we need to evacuate our current position due to flood danger," Tom finally called up to her. "We're going to attempt access from the top of the ridge, but it's going to take time. How are your supplies? Can you hold your position for several hours?" Sarah looked around her damaged shelter and made a quick inventory. Her space blanket was destroyed. Her first aid kit was mostly scattered and ruined. She had perhaps half a bottle of water that had survived the fall and no food at all. The temperature was dropping as the storm intensified, and she was already beginning to shiver, despite the adrenaline that was keeping her functioning. "I can hold position," she called back, because there was no other acceptable answer. Rangers didn't give up, and they didn't make rescue operations more dangerous by panicking. But privately, Sarah knew she was in serious trouble. The rain was falling steadily now, turning from scattered drops to a continuous downpour that was quickly soaking through her torn uniform. Without proper shelter, hypothermia was becoming a real possibility within hours. The cuts and scrapes covering her body were starting to sting as rain washed salt and dirt into the wounds. Worse, she was beginning to feel dizzy and nauseated, potential signs of concussion that she hadn't noticed during the immediate aftermath of her fall. If she lost consciousness on the narrow ledge, she would almost certainly fall to her death. Sarah forced herself to focus on immediate survival priorities. Shelter was most important, followed by warmth and preventing further injury. Using her one functioning arm, she began gathering pine boughs to create a crude lean-to against the mountain face. The work was exhausting with her injuries, but it kept her moving and generating body heat. As she worked, she could hear the rescue team below packing their equipment and moving to higher ground. Their voices grew fainter as they evacuated the ravine floor, leaving her alone once again, with only the sound of wind and rain for company. The isolation was almost harder to bear than the physical pain. For the first time since her fall, Sarah felt genuine fear beginning to override her professional training. She had survived the impossible fall, but now she was facing hours of exposure to worsening weather conditions while injured and alone. People died from less severe situations than this every year in the mountains. But Sarah Martinez had not spent 8 years as a forest ranger without learning something about the power of mental toughness. As the rain continued to fall and the wind began to howl through the pine trees around her, she settled into her makeshift shelter and began the patient work of staying alive 1 minute at a time. The storm that was making her rescue so difficult was about to teach her that surviving the fall had been only the first test. The mountain wasn't finished with her yet. 3 hours into the storm, Sarah Martinez was losing the battle against hypothermia. Despite her makeshift shelter of pine boughs, the constant rain had soaked through her torn uniform completely. Her body temperature was dropping steadily, and she could feel her thinking becoming sluggish and confused. The early stages of hypothermic shock. The lean-to she had constructed was providing minimal protection from the wind, but it couldn't stop the water that was cascading down the mountain face above her. Every few minutes, a new stream of runoff would find its way into her shelter, adding to the pool of water that was slowly accumulating on the narrow ledge. Sarah knew she needed to stay awake and keep moving to generate body heat, but every movement sent waves of agony through her broken ribs and shattered collarbone. The pain medication in her first aid kit had been scattered during the rock slide, and she was operating on nothing but willpower and stubbornness. That's when she heard the helicopter. Through the howling wind and rain, the distinctive sound of rotor blades was unmistakable. Sarah felt a surge of hope that briefly overcame the cold and pain. Rescue was coming. She just needed to signal her position and hold on a little longer. But as the helicopter sound grew closer, Sarah realized that something was wrong. The engine noise was irregular, stuttering and surging in a way that suggested mechanical problems. Through the rain and clouds, she caught glimpses of an aircraft that was clearly struggling to maintain stable flight. The helicopter that appeared through the storm wasn't a rescue aircraft at all. It was a news chopper from Denver that had been monitoring emergency radio frequencies and decided to attempt footage of the rescue operation. The pilot, inexperienced in mountain flying and caught off guard by the severity of the weather conditions, was fighting to keep his aircraft airborne in winds that were far beyond his skill level. Sarah watched in horror as the helicopter lost altitude rapidly, its tail spinning as the pilot struggled with controls that were no longer responding properly. The aircraft struck the ridge face about 200 yards from her position, exploding in a ball of fire that briefly lit up the storm-darkened mountainside. The explosion echoed through the ravines like thunder, and Sarah realized that what should have been her rescue had just turned into another emergency. Now the rescue teams would have to split their resources between reaching her and responding to the helicopter crash. Worse, the crash site was upwind from her position, and she could already smell aviation fuel and burning debris carried by the mountain winds.
No, 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 she whispered to herself, feeling despair creep in for the first time since her fall.
This isn't happening. But it was happening. And Sarah had to face the reality that her rescue had just become significantly more complicated.
Through her damaged radio, she could hear the frantic communications between rescue teams as they tried to coordinate response to multiple emergencies simultaneously. "We have a confirmed aircraft down at grid reference 77 Alpha." Tom Rodriguez's voice crackled through the static. "Unknown number of souls on board. Ranger Martinez, if you can hear this. We're dealing with a secondary emergency. Hang tight. We haven't forgotten about you." Sarah keyed her radio with numb fingers that barely responded to her commands. "Tom, I copy. I can see the crash site from my position. Heavy smoke, no signs of survivors. Prioritize the crash site. I'm stable for now." It was a lie, and everyone probably knew it. She wasn't stable. She was slowly freezing to death on a narrow ledge while injured and exhausted. But it was what a ranger was supposed to say in this situation. Other people's emergencies took priority, even when you were fighting for your own survival. What Sarah couldn't know was that Tom Rodriguez was facing an impossible decision. The helicopter crash had killed both pilot and cameraman instantly. There were no survivors to rescue, but department protocol required that crash sites be secured immediately, and the weather conditions were making it impossible to reach both locations simultaneously with the resources available. Meanwhile, Sarah's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of blood loss, exposure, and shock was pushing her body past its limits. She found herself having to fight to stay conscious, and she knew that falling asleep in her current condition would likely be fatal. That's when she remembered something from her wilderness survival training that she had never thought she would need to use. In extreme cold weather situations, when shelter and external heat sources aren't available, the human body can sometimes maintain core temperature through controlled physical activity, even when injured. Sarah began forcing herself to perform isometric exercises, tensing and relaxing muscle groups in sequence to generate heat without requiring major movement that might worsen her injuries or cause her to fall. It was agonizing with broken ribs, but it kept her blood circulating, and her mind focused on something other than the cold and pain. She also began talking to herself out loud, partly to stay awake and partly to maintain her radio discipline in case rescue teams were monitoring her emergency frequency. She recited everything she could remember from her training manuals, described her current condition in clinical detail, and even started working through complex mathematical problems to keep her mind sharp. Body core temperature estimated at 92.4 degrees and falling, she reported to her radio, even though she wasn't sure anyone was listening. Mild hypothermia confirmed. Consciousness remains stable. Injuries include probable fractured clavicle, minimum 2 broken ribs, multiple lacerations, and possible mild concussion. Current shelter is marginal but holding. The professional terminology helped her maintain emotional distance from her situation. She wasn't a person slowly freezing to death on a mountain ledge. She was a ranger conducting a damage assessment and maintaining situational awareness. The psychological technique was something she had learned for dealing with traumatic rescue situations, but she had never expected to use it on herself. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to notice that the storm was actually intensifying rather than passing through as originally predicted. The rain had turned to sleet, and she could see snow beginning to fall at higher elevations. The temperature was dropping below what her damaged clothing and makeshift shelter could handle. But then, through the storm noise, she heard something that made her heart race with hope. Voices. Human voices, much closer than before, and coming from above rather than below. The rescue team had apparently reached the top of the ridge and was attempting to rappel down to her position. "Can you hear us? We're coming down to you." The voice belonged to Maria Santos, a technical rescue specialist that Sarah had worked with on previous emergencies. "I hear you," Sarah called back, using strength she didn't know she still had. "I'm conscious and responsive. My position is stable." What she could see when she looked up was both encouraging and terrifying. 2 rescue specialists were rappelling down the rock face through the storm, moving with the careful precision of experts who understood that one mistake would send them tumbling to join her on the ledge or fall past her entirely. The technical challenges they were facing were enormous. The rock face was slick with rain and sleet. The wind was strong enough to slam a rappelling person against the rocks with potentially fatal force. Worse, they were working in near darkness as the storm clouds blocked out most of the remaining daylight. "Sarah, we're going to lower medical supplies and warming gear to you first," Maria called down. "Then we'll assess whether we can safely extract you tonight or if we need to wait for weather conditions to improve." The first equipment bundle reached her 20 minutes later, lowered on a rope that swayed dangerously in the wind. Inside the waterproof bag, Sarah found dry socks, a proper emergency bivy sack, chemical heat packs, and basic medical supplies. Most importantly, there was a thermos of hot soup that felt like liquid salvation when she managed to get some down. But as Maria and her partner continued their descent, it became clear that extracting Sarah in current conditions was going to be extremely dangerous, if not impossible. The rescue specialists were barely maintaining control of their own rappel in the high winds, and trying to manage an injured person on the same ropes would likely result in multiple casualties. "Sarah, we're going to establish an anchor point about 30 feet above your position and wait out the worst of this storm," Maria called down. "We'll have you out of here as soon as conditions allow safe extraction, but it might be several more hours." Several more hours. Sarah wrapped herself in the emergency bivvy and activated the chemical heat packs, feeling genuine warmth for the first time since her fall. She was no longer alone, and professional help was within reach. But she also understood that her ordeal was far from over. The mountain that had tried to kill her with a 300-foot fall was now trying to finish the job with hypothermia, rock slides, and weather that was testing the limits of even expert rescue teams. Sarah Martinez had proven that rangers could survive impossible falls, but now she needed to prove they could outlast impossible conditions while help waited just out of reach. Dawn came slowly to Devil's Ridge, filtered through storm clouds that were finally beginning to break apart after 14 hours of relentless rain and wind. Sarah Martinez watched the first rays of sunlight touch the opposite wall of the ravine and felt something she hadn't experienced since her fall. Genuine hope that she would survive this ordeal. The night had been the longest of her life. Despite the warming gear provided by the rescue team, she had spent hours fighting off hypothermia while listening to the wind howl through the pine trees around her. Maria Santos and her partner had maintained their position 30 feet above, providing constant radio contact and moral support, but they had been unable to attempt extraction in the dangerous conditions. "How are you feeling this morning, Sarah?" Maria's voice came through the radio with welcome clarity as the storm interference finally diminished. "Cold, sore, and ready to get off this mountain," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded, but alive and thinking clearly. "What's the extraction plan?" What she couldn't see from her position was the complex operation that had been developing throughout the night. Tom Rodriguez had called in specialized high-angle rescue teams from 3 different agencies. They had helicopter support standing by at the nearest airport, waiting for weather conditions to improve enough for safe flying. Most importantly, they had brought equipment specifically designed for extracting injured persons from technical terrain. The plan they had developed was ambitious and dangerous, but it was the only option that could get Sarah to medical care quickly enough to address her injuries properly. Rather than trying to bring her up the unstable rock face where she had originally fallen, they were going to lower her down to a more stable section of the ravine floor, then extract her horizontally to a landing zone that helicopters could access safely.
"We're going to get you out of here in the next 2 hours," Maria explained.
"But I need to warn you, it's going to be uncomfortable with your injuries, and we're going to need you to stay conscious and responsive throughout the entire process." Sarah understood that uncomfortable was rescue terminology for extremely painful but necessary. With her broken ribs and shattered collarbone, being moved at all was going to be agonizing. Being lowered down a cliff face in a rescue harness would be excruciating, but it was her only chance of receiving proper medical care before her injuries became life-threatening. The first phase of the rescue required getting Sarah secured in a specialized stretcher that could be controlled during a vertical descent. This meant that Maria had to rappel down to Sarah's position and work in the cramped space of the pine tree cluster while managing her own safety and Sarah's injuries simultaneously. "This is going to hurt," Maria warned as she began the careful process of immobilizing Sarah's left arm and securing her broken ribs with medical tape. "I need you to tell me immediately if you feel any numbness in your legs or any difficulty breathing." The pain was worse than Sarah had expected. Moving her body into the rescue stretcher felt like being stabbed by a dozen knives simultaneously. But she bit down on the pain and focused on following Maria's instructions exactly. 8 years as a ranger had taught her that professional rescue operations required absolute trust between team members. "Stretcher secured," Maria reported to the team above. "Patient is stable and ready for descent, beginning lower phase in 60 seconds. What followed was one of the most technically challenging rescues ever attempted on Devil's Ridge. The stretcher had to be lowered almost 300 feet down an unstable rock face while maintaining precise control to prevent Sarah from being slammed against the rocks. Wind conditions, while improved from the night before, were still strong enough to make the descent extremely dangerous. Sarah experienced the journey as a series of controlled falls punctuated by sudden stops and course corrections. Sometimes she was lowering smoothly, watching the rock face slide past inches from her head. Other times she was spinning slowly as the rescue teams above fought to control her descent in gusty wind conditions. Halfway down, disaster almost struck again. A section of loose rock above her position gave way without warning, sending a cascade of stones directly toward her position. Maria, still rappelling alongside the stretcher to monitor Sarah's condition, saw the rockfall developing and made a split-second decision that probably saved Sarah's life. Using her own body as a shield, Maria swung herself between Sarah and the falling rocks. Several large stones struck her protective gear and helmet, but none reached Sarah.
The maneuver sent both women swinging wildly across the rock face, but the rescue ropes held and the descent continued.
"Are you okay?" Sarah asked, seeing blood on Maria's face where a rock fragment had found a gap in her protective gear.
"Just a scratch," Maria replied, though Sarah could tell she was in pain. "Rangers look out for each other, right?" The rest of the descent proceeded without incident, and 40 minutes after they began, Sarah felt solid ground beneath the rescue stretcher for the first time in 18 hours. She was at the bottom of the ravine, surrounded by the rescue team that had been working around the clock to reach her. But the rescue wasn't over yet. The ravine floor, while stable, was still nearly a mile from the nearest location where a helicopter could land safely. Sarah had to be transported through rough terrain while strapped to a wheeled rescue stretcher, a journey that took another hour and tested every piece of equipment and every team member's endurance. When the helicopter finally appeared over the landing zone, Sarah felt tears running down her face, for the first time since her ordeal began. Not tears of pain or fear, but tears of gratitude for the dozens of people who had risked their own safety to save her life. The flight to Denver General Hospital took 25 minutes, during which Sarah received IV fluids, pain medication, and constant monitoring of her vital signs. The medical team was amazed that she had survived not just the fall, but 18 hours of exposure in severe weather conditions with multiple serious injuries. Dr. Darway, Jennifer Walsh, the trauma surgeon who treated Sarah's injuries, would later say that the case challenged everything she thought she knew about human survival limits. The combination of injuries she sustained, the environmental conditions she endured, and the length of time before rescue should have been fatal. Dr. Walsh explained. Her survival was due to exceptional training, incredible mental toughness, and probably a significant amount of luck. The surgery to repair Sarah's shattered collarbone took 4 hours and required the insertion of titanium plates and screws. Her broken ribs were stabilized, and dozens of cuts and scrapes were cleaned and sutured. She spent 6 days in intensive care, followed by 3 weeks of regular hospitalization and months of physical therapy. But the most remarkable part of Sarah's recovery wasn't physical. It was her determination to return to the work that had nearly cost her life. 9 months after her fall, she was back on duty as a Forest Service ranger, with some modifications to accommodate her injuries, but with her passion for mountain rescue work completely intact. The incident at Devil's Ridge led to significant changes in rescue protocols and safety procedures. The Forest Service now requires backup aircraft for all helicopter rescue operations in mountainous terrain. Weather thresholds for high-risk operations were adjusted based on the conditions that nearly killed Sarah. Most importantly, the case became a training example used to teach rescue professionals about the importance of never giving up, even in seemingly hopeless situations. Marcus Webb, the missing hiker whose disappearance had triggered the rescue operation that led to Sarah's fall, was found 3 days later by a different search team. He had taken shelter in a cave system during the storm and emerged with minor injuries, and a story about hearing helicopter crashes and rescue operations echoing through the mountains while he waited out the weather. Sarah never met Marcus personally, but she learned that he had requested that any publicity about his rescue be directed toward the Forest Service teams who had risked their lives searching for him. "I'm just glad everyone made it out alive," he told reporters. "What those rangers do every day is heroic, and I don't want anyone to forget that." 2 years after the incident, Sarah Martinez received the Department of Interior's Valor Award for her actions during the Devil's Ridge rescue operation. The citation read in part, "Ranger Martinez demonstrated extraordinary courage, professional skill, and dedication to duty under conditions of extreme personal danger. Her actions exemplify the highest traditions of the Forest Service and serve as an inspiration to all who serve in emergency response roles." But Sarah's favorite recognition came from an unexpected source. Jake Thompson, the helicopter pilot whose mechanical problems had caused her fall in the first place, visited her in the hospital during her recovery. He brought with him a small plaque that he had made in his garage workshop. The plaque read, "Rangers don't need parachutes. They have training, courage, and stubborn determination." Sarah Martinez, Devil's Ridge survivor. Proof that the impossible is just another day's work. Sarah kept that plaque on her desk throughout the rest of her career with the Forest Service. It served as a reminder that sometimes, when everything goes wrong and death seems certain, the human spirit combined with proper training and absolute refusal to give up can overcome impossible odds. She returned to Devil's Ridge exactly 1 year after her fall, leading a training exercise for new rescue specialists. Standing on the solid ground at the bottom of the ravine, looking up at the pine trees that had saved her life, Sarah Martinez smiled and spoke to her trainees with the authority of someone who had tested every survival principle under the worst possible conditions. "Remember," she told them, "we don't train for the easy rescues. We train for the day when everything goes wrong, when the weather turns deadly, when equipment fails, and when the only thing standing between life and death is your knowledge, your determination, and your refusal to quit. That's the day you find out what being a ranger really means." The mountain that had tried to kill her had instead made her stronger, more skilled, and absolutely certain that no emergency situation was hopeless as long as people were willing to fight for each other's survival. Sarah Martinez had proven that rangers don't need parachutes. They need something much more powerful, the training and courage to face the impossible and find a way to survive.